airliner with 118 passengers on board has crashed on the M1 motorway in Leicestershire. It came down near Kegworth.
It's now known at least 10 people were killed when a British Midlands Boeing 737 crash-landed on the M1 motorway at Junction 24 in Leicestershire. There were 100
aircraft, which is now straddling a 30-feet-high embankment beside the motorway. The rescue services are still pulling people from the wreckage. A lot of them are survivors.
Boeing 737, the British Midlands Airways, came down on an embankment right beside the M1. Some of the survivors walked away from the wreckage, but most were helped down.
We'll ask the experts how an airliner delivered just a few
teams.
weeks ago could so soon crash in flames.
Picture this, it's midwinter, January the 8th, 1989. About 26,000 feet up in the air and just minutes into the British Midland flight BD92 from Heathrow to Belfast, my life was about to change. The plane began to violently vibrate. I looked out the window at flames licking out of the rear of the left-hand engine. I knew then that my life would never be the same ever again. The plane plummeted towards the ground. All I could do was wait for the inevitable impact. Looking around the cabin, I could see the fear on people's faces as they had already accepted they were going to die as the ground got ever closer. Smoke started to pour into the cabin from the engine, heightening people's fear to a totally new level. I began to have concern for those around me, as they uncontrollably panicked, not knowing how to handle fear as I'd been trained to do so. I put my hope in one person at that moment in time, and that was the pilot. I had no understanding of hope to be found in Jesus Christ, so all hope was going on another human being alone. Brace, brace, brace!
Nigel, where were you born?
Crawley in West Sussex. Crawleyite.
And a happy childhood?
Reasonably, up to about the age of 11 or 12. My parents' relationship was on rocky ground and they actually decided to part ways. So along with that comes all the sort of bitterness that parents have, and sometimes children get thrown in the midst of that. But generally I had a pretty happy childhood. Money was short and times were hard sometimes, but yeah, I had a reasonably happy childhood.
And who did you live with, your mum or your dad?
I lived with my mum and dad until they got separated, then divorced, and lived with my mum most of the time. But then my mum got remarried. Obviously, I had another man in the house, and I believe I was at an age where hormones were flying about, and I was rebelling because there was another man coming over to take her over in my house, and I just didn't like it.
So you didn't really get on with your stepdad?
No, we physically fought.
Right. So what did you do?
I beat him up.
So presumably you had to leave home?
Yes. I left home and moved in with my real father for a couple of months. Couldn't handle that and stayed with some aunties and that. And then after the sort of aftermath, as it were, of my actions with my stepfather, things had calmed down. I moved back in for a little while, but still things weren't great.
But eventually you left home and joined the army?
Yeah. Before that, I got myself an apprenticeship, but part of growing up, wanted to be a lad and stuff like that. I was trying to run before I could walk and got myself into all sorts of bother in this apprenticeship I had, and eventually got fired. And I couldn't stand living at home anymore. And in a discussion with one of my uncles who was from the Falklands War as a soldier, he said, "Why don't you join the army?" He says, "They'll put money in your back pocket, put a roof over your head, you'll travel the world, you can drink booze all the time, plenty of women," and I was going for it.
So where did you serve?
Northern Ireland, Canterbury, Cyprus during the Gulf War, and then back in England during my transition from army to Civvy Street, when the military decided that I was no longer physically able to serve as an infantry soldier.
And how did your time in the army shape your view of the world?
As an infantry soldier, they teach you that you're pretty much, not literally in the sense of, but the training you have gives you an attitude that you're indestructible, that you are the blood of the country, and I think for some of us it goes even deeper without even realising that your country owes you something. And I love my country dearly today. But I did before I joined the army, but I went for a stage after the army where I wasn't looked after, where I just felt that my country owed me everything because of what I'd suffered. So.
And you were serving in Northern Ireland when you boarded this plane?
Yeah, I was involved in an operation called Up Cara, and we were part of a team that put heavy presence underground to show the paramilitaries that we meant business. And the time before the crash, things were quite heavy, and they worked it out so that we could have an extended long weekend, because they knew that the coming year was going to bring some real heavy stuff that we had to do. And that subsequently was the weekend that Flight BD92 crashed.
And were you flying home to see someone? What was the plan? Go for a weekend with the lads, or was there someone at home that you wanted to see?
I met my first wife in a shop in a particular part of Northern Ireland that we were allowed to go to in our social time. And we got engaged, and we decided we were going to get married in England, and we saw the opportunity for us both to go back and make final arrangements with my parents, my best man and friends for our forthcoming wedding.
And she wasn't on the flight with you?
No, because I was issued an army warrant which basically told me who I was going to fly with, and because Heather wasn't my wife at the time, she was my fiancée, I had to pay for a ticket, and the only ticket I could get her was a British Airways one.
So she flew home on one flight and you flew home on another. So tell us what happened on that flight. Everything was normal?
Yeah, we arrived at Heathrow. I said goodbye to my best mate Peter, who'd driven us up there, and his fiancée at the time, and said my goodbyes to Heather, give her a kiss, and said, right, I'll see you the other side, because she was taking off before me. She took all our luggage, and she'd be waiting there, having retrieved our luggage, and all I had to do was get off the plane and we'd walk out. So Heather's flight took off, around about 7 o'clock-ish, I believe, and waited for my flight. We got into about 20 minutes into my flight, and already there were problems when I think back, looking, but sometimes when you're taking off in a plane, you get your turbulence and all these bits of vibration as the plane's settling down and stuff, and you just take this as the norm. But after a while, it became apparent that there was a serious problem at hand, because there was lots of grinding noises and banging noises, and at that point it got seriously dark, and where I was sitting in 17A was pretty much a front row seat as to what was happening with the left-hand engine. And basically one of the blades had snapped off and forced itself into the engine itself, which caused a stall, and the engine caught on fire. And I could, basically, as I said, I had a front row seat to the flames licking out of the rear of the engine. Because this was a new design of plane, only had 500 hours flight recording on it, and the pilots were still getting used to it, even though they'd done all the simulator training. They were really confused with the situation, because the cockpit was telling them that it was the right-hand engine that was a problem. So they subsequently switched off the right-hand engine, and we became the world's biggest glider, because now the left-hand engine had failed and they switched off the right-hand engine, and before they realised what was going on, we'd ascended so far that they weren't able to restart the engine by stalling purposes.
And what was happening in the cabin around you?
People started to become aware of that there was a problem, and that even though the cabin staff were really calm, it seemed to be issues that just weren't being dealt with or couldn't be resolved. And as I said, you know, people's height of fear, when you know there's a problem and it doesn't seem to be resolved, your brain starts working overtime. What if? And we've all seen movies where planes have crashed, and the devastation that's created and the loss of life and stuff like this. So I should imagine a lot of that was going through people's minds, and people were getting overexcited, panicking, screaming, for whatever reasons, trying to get out of their seats. It just became a slow, gradual course of mayhem.
And presumably your army training helped you?
Yeah, I look back now and I think it was a great, my army training, because our Northern Ireland training was so intense, we were, that old movie thing, adapt and overcome, that's basically what we were taught to do in times of crisis. And I actually found myself looking back now not in a panicking state. I looked around the room and I felt individualised, as it were, amongst. There were other soldiers on there. I don't know who they were. None of them were from my unit, but there were quite a lot on there. And plane's a big place in a time like that. I felt very individualised, very separate from the others, because I just didn't have any fear as such. I was just sort of like, well, there's a way to sort this out, and that has actually come back to haunt me over the years, because it's just, I believe it's just something that we attach to this defence mechanism where we don't deal with. We deal with the situation there and then, but we don't actually deal with the consequences of it, of how it affects our bodies.
So tell us about the moment when you realised that it was out of control and the plane was going to crash.
Well, as sad as it sounds, they came around and took the meal trays off our laps, off our trays in front of us. And in those days, they used to issue you with a nice meal with a plastic bottle of wine. And I had the attitude, well, there's something wrong here, but I wasn't panicking. I thought, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die. There's nothing I can do about it. And I sort of thought, well, I'll have one last drink. And that's the attitude I had as an individual in life, not just in that situation at the time. So I supped on this bottle of wine. At this point, the plane was really stooping low. And it got to the point where there was an old couple next to me. The old boy very much resembled my grandfather. I really can't picture his face, but it's just his demeanour, his posture. The fact that he was wearing one of the old-fashioned style East End Cockney donkey jackets as well. And he just tapped me on the shoulders and he said, "What do we do?" And it was at that point I raised my arms to my head and I said, "This." And it was at that same point, and that was just a saving grace for me, I believe, because I saw many atrocious head injuries in that plane immediately after the main impact, where people hadn't had time to cover their heads. And it was purely that man saying to me, "What do we do?" and me showing him physically at the same time when the pilot cried out, "Brace, brace, brace," that we had the first initial impact, which was where we hit the trees on the Kegworth side of the M1 motorway. And then immediately from that point onwards, it was just like like if you see on TV where they had these, I think it's Volkswagen or Audi, do this advert with test crash dummies. We see the bodies, these test dummies being just thrown around like a dolly. I remember the immediate effect of that, and then just silence, darkness. And I believe it was I was initially in an unconscious state, but aware of my surroundings. I couldn't hear what was going on, I couldn't see what was going on, but I believe that I had this moment, and some people describe it as like an out-of-body experience or whatever. But it was like in the film Mission Impossible, where the movie star is like lowered down this tunnel from above to below, with wires attached to his back and arms to support his body in a crucifix-like position. And I just remember looking at myself in that position, looking down into darkness with silence. And then all of a sudden, just the reality, life itself just came rushing back. And now I was back in the plane, in the reality, the physicality, with light coming in from behind me where the rear end of the plane had snapped off. Bodies hanging above me to my left, my right, and down below, and limp bodies to my right and in front and behind me, and a woman behind me who had both her limbs snapped across the shins, scratching at my face from behind to help her out. The fire services eventually got in, snapped the seat in front of me down, because in an impact all the seats snapped forward, the backrest parts, and they managed to get me out, and I realised I was paralysed from the waist down. I couldn't move my legs, and I managed to pull the lady from behind me onto my chest. That was when I realised she snapped both her legs across the shins, and she was bleeding profusely, and I managed to get her to the exit, they took her away into the darkness, the cold night. It was freezing. And looking around me at that point, I realised it was just like, I don't know if you've ever had in my house, we have a chicken most Sundays, and by the time my family have got around it, there's not much left of it but a carcass, a weak and limp carcass, and that's exactly what the plane resembled on the inside. The whole interior just disintegrated, disappeared, and all that was left was wires and girders. And I could hear some moaning from behind the chair that was immediately behind the door where I'd left this lady to be taken out. And I crawled round there, and I just witnessed the most atrocious scene. It was there's this young girl, pretty young girl. I remember her getting on the plane, and she was one of the victims of the inability to be able to protect her head and face, because her face was just a complete mess. It didn't resemble a face where her face should be, and the whole of the wall that was left and surrounding area was just covered in blood, and she was struggling to breathe, and I managed to clear her airway, and it was at that point that the reality of the whole situation, you see, as human beings, we can do so much in our own strength, but I think there becomes a point where our true physicality in how God created us as human beings, the limit of our expectations as a human being, comes into reality where he says stop, and that came in with the adrenaline wearing off and the reality that I am weak like the next person, no matter how trained I am as a soldier. And I just basically started to shut down mentally. So inside I was saying I can't cope with this anymore, couldn't do it, I just stopped. And then I remember being grabbed by a fireman, and again, still unable to use my legs. I felt no pain either. It was really, really weird. And they put me on a ladder because they'd run out of gurneys or whatever you call them, bodyboards, and just passed me down over hundreds of people that had turned up that were helping the emergency services. And then they left me laying on the M1 motorway.
Nigel, how many people died on that crash?
47.
So you end up in hospital?
Well, when I was laying there, the whole thing with this was taking me back to when after the initial impact and this lady was scratching my face, I went into sort of military mode, and it was like, right, I've got my dog tags, I've got my military ID card, because I was convinced, I was flying to Belfast and I thought we'd crashed in Belfast. And we're taught how to deal with incidents outside military ops that happen to us when we're in unfamiliar territories, such as Northern Ireland, and one of them is to demand a military sort of police escort and stuff like that, and that's what I was doing until I actually was put in the back of the ambulance, and I heard someone mention the Queen's Medical Centre at Nottingham. Then I realised that I was actually crashed in England and not in Belfast, and it was at that point when my body just said, "You're safe," and I went unconscious again through shock, I suppose, and I can't remember exactly how many days, but it was quite a few days. I remember anything.
And what were your injuries?
I had multiple fractures to my skull, the front of my face. I had open book pelvis, which is where the pelvis snaps through from the bottom of the spine and then through where the hip joints are. So the book, it basically lays open like an open book. Broken ankle, smashed in kneecaps, chest contusions, but the worst of all was the after effects, which was the psychological stuff.
And how long were you in hospital?
On and off for about 18 months with everything that I had to deal with.
And eventually the army say you're not fit enough to stay in the army?
Yeah.
So you're pensioned out?
Yeah, well, that after that, we Heather and I did actually get married, and we had a child, and she's now grown up, married, been married 4 years. She knows the Lord. And the military, yeah, they turned around and said, I think it was about 3 years afterwards, that they'd done everything they could to get me back to as physically fit and as psychologically stable as possible as they could do, and now was the time for me to move on.
So where did you and Heather go to live?
Went back to my hometown. We ended up getting a flat that the army, the council together through one of the military, sort of, I think it was SAFA or something like that at the time, sort of liaised with these two bodies and sort of managed to get us pushed to the front of the queue as far as housing was concerned because of my issues I had. But it wasn't just me that had issues.
Yeah. So psychologically, for both of you, this was a time of real trauma.
Yeah.
And how did you both deal with that?
For me, it was drink, drugs, anything that could cloud the thoughts and the feelings I had. But I was so sort of engrossed in my issues and the way I felt and everything else as a young man, because I look at photographs now and I was just a kid when I went to Northern Ireland and when this crash happened. I was just a kid. Didn't really have the best of upbringing as far as looking around me at other people. It was sort of a survivor instinct was to worry about myself. And Heather was quite evidently, now I realise, having her own issues with the whole situation, and I hold my hands up to say that amongst the crash and everything else I'd experienced, while not being my fault, I had choices in my life to sort of deal with things whichever way I chose to deal with them, and one thing I didn't notice was how she was feeling, maybe the way I spoke to her, and, you know, all had a big part to play in sort of the culmination of what happened with her.
So she started drinking as well?
Well, no, I never ever once remember her drinking. It just got to the point where I think she'd had enough of dealing with the aftermath of what happened, that was happening through me, and probably the way I was treating her and how she felt about the whole situation. She just, it must have been absolutely awful for her, because we had Natalie, our daughter, and she was 23 months old. And she was in her cot in the next room, and she just made the decision that she couldn't cope anymore. And the army had issued me 6 months worth of prescription for my medications that I was on, for psychological stuff and physical stuff. And she decided that enough was enough for her, and she took what some people would say is the easy way out, but I don't believe it's easy at all, because it takes a lot. She decided to end her life using my medication. I've been called to be very brave in my life, and the one thing I know I couldn't do, I think, is step up and take my life, give my life. I know what Jesus did was totally different to the decision that Heather made, but it's a big decision either way. Whatever reason you decide to make that decision for, it's a big, big decision. It takes a lot of courage. The night before it happened, my dad said he was going to take us for a beer, me and my brother, and I jumped at the chance. And the last thing Heather said to me as I left the flat that evening was, "Make sure you're home by 9 o'clock." And it was as if she knew that I wasn't going to be home again, because that was the pattern I seemed to set. I used to go out for a drink and not come home. And I was doing things I shouldn't be doing, going here, going there, and again, I failed. I let her down. I woke up at 9:50, on my dad's living room floor, and I just knew in my spirit, right there and then, there was something seriously wrong. I shouted at my brother, who had also fallen asleep on the floor next to me, and went home, and as I opened the front door I could hear Natalie crying, and I pushed open her bedroom door. She's standing there crying, red face, snotty nose. I just said to my brother, I said, get Natalie, I said, I'll go and put the kettle on. And my bed was made in my bedroom, which was the norm as I walked past, and so I didn't take any notice, but as I got to the end of the hallway and I pushed open the living room door, I could sort of see Heather laying on the sofa, and her eyes were open, and she's an Irish woman, and I always knew the worst thing with her, if she was shouting at me, I was okay, but if she was silent, she was on quite several occasions, I was in big trouble, and there was silence, so I just carried on walking into the kitchen, and as I switched the kettle on, that whole millisecond of a moment where I'd spotted her in the living room just all came rushing back to me. The reality, the true picture of what I'd seen wasn't just a body of an angry woman laying there, ignoring me. And it was something completely different. I turned around and there's my 17-year-old brother with my daughter in his arms looking into the living room, and my brother's like a white Roman statue for what he could see, and Heather was dead. She was lying dead on the sofa, and every part of me in my military training just kicked in again. It's all great having this training and everything, but sometimes it's just... Anyway.
So now you're the survivor of a plane crash. You're a man who's lost his wife. You're a single parent. Mm-hmm. So what happens next? You end up in Spain. How did that happen?
After Heather died, I obviously had the social services on my back because there's now a single man looking after a young girl. They agreed that I was doing a good job looking after her, and I got myself involved. I love having people around me. I'm a people person, and I believe every man should have a good woman at his side. And I was just trying to find comfort, and I got myself involved in all sorts of unhealthy relationships with women. And eventually, by God's grace, I was blessed in meeting my now wife, Reagan, of 17, 18 years. But still, she filled a great part of my life. But still there was something seriously missing, and I just couldn't put my finger on it, and I was constantly running all the time. I couldn't find, it's as if I was waiting for the right bus. It never came, so I went to another bus stop to find the right bus, but that bus never came. But actually that's not so much a lie, but an interpretation of I once heard a story about a guy that was in distress in the sea, and he was calling out to God to save him, and God sent a rowing boat. He said, no, God's going to save me. Then he sent a speedboat. No, God's going to save me. Then he sent a helicopter. And he said, no, God's going to save me. And then he died. We went to heaven, and God said, what are you playing at? He said, well, I prayed to you. I needed you to come and save me. He said, I sent a rowing boat, a speedboat, and a helicopter. What more do you want? And I had that presentation of Christ coming before me, I believe, and I look back several times now, because God's got a plan for each of us, and he steps in some of the most unusual situations to present himself to us, and we have choices in life, and I chose on several occasions not to accept him.
So you're in Spain, you're with a new wife, some more children have come along,
yeah,
and things began to settle down. Spain was a good experience.
It was a good experience to start off with, but again, I was just running. I believed that my country owed me a great deal, and I wasn't getting the support I needed. I was just being dealt loads and loads of knocks, and I just thought going to Spain would get me away from the crash stuff and all this stuff that I just didn't want to be around. And going to Spain was like sunshine every day. The children went to school, sat around the pool, and it just all sounds idyllic and stuff. But you bury this stuff under the carpet, and it comes back for you to trip over one day, and it's just so you never actually get away from the problems in life. You have to deal with them full on, front on, and that's exactly what I wasn't doing. I got myself a job working for a beer company, which wasn't the right thing, but actually, in my eyes, but it turned out to be the right thing because it was all part of my walk. My habits were being fed. I could drink as much as I wanted. I mean, in the staff canteen, there was a fridge with beer in it. The boss supplied all that, knowing that full well we were driving lorries delivering beer all day. And I used to be able to pick up any drugs I wanted in the bars that I went to. It was a haven. It was just like it was like buying a packet of Smarties off the shelf.
Eventually, you end up in a place called Fuengirola,
Yeah.
and you meet a guy called Alfonso.
Yeah.
So how did you end up in Fuengirola, and how did you meet a guy called Alfonso?
Well, one night after working with a beer company, depending on the type of day I'd had, and with the past issues I had with the crash and Northern Ireland and Heather's death and all this sort of stuff, sometimes these things would come up and creep up on me and taunt me. You know, I believe the devil used them to get at me and just make my life hell, as it were. I finished work one night, went to a bar. I was intending to go home, but I got a 40-minute journey. You have a lot of time to think, and I changed my mind on the way home and went straight past my house to the local town, which was Ala Grande. And I went to this bar. That was a 24-hour bar. There was a guy in there known in the town, English guy, who had serious drink problem himself, was causing problems. And I actually did the right thing. I walked away from that present situation to be on my own. And I was dwelling that evening on why, even though I was remarried and I had further children, that remember clearly, why did Heather take my drugs? Why did she do what she did? Why did she leave me? Etc. etc. So I had a fire burning in the pit of my stomach with anger, and this guy that was causing trouble came over to get some comfort from me because he was getting a verbal battering off everybody else. Cut long story short, I just lost it with him because of his attitude, and I beat him to within minutes of his life. I didn't get arrested. Nothing happened. The guy, I understand, was told that if he did anything, i.e. report me or anything like that, they'd finish him off because he was such a bad person in the town. The Spanish had had enough of him. A couple of days after this happened, I woke up and I sat on my bed and I was just a broken person. I just didn't like who I was, didn't like where I was at. And I heard a voice, I heard clearly, and I believe it was God. He spoke to me, he said, get your family out of here and go to the coast. That's how we ended up in Fuengirola. I did that. I didn't know Christ as my saviour. I didn't know who God was in any way, shape or form. I'd heard little bits and pieces about him through the years, as I said, but never really took the reality of who God was on board. We moved to the coast, and through the children wanting to have a desire for after school clubs, I got invited to a dinner one evening to help out with some children's stuff that I really wasn't interested in, but I was tempted by the fact that the food and the drink was free. And I went along, and that's how I met Alfonso, and I got introduced to this lovely Spanish guy. He looks a bit like Henry Winkler, and they called him the Fonz. And he basically shared the gospel of Christ with me that night, and my life just completely changed. It was like someone switching the light on. I could see so clearly about what life was really about. The reality of what he did for me, even though I didn't know him, it was just like, no one's ever done that for me. No one's ever stepped up and done something like that for me. And that was the journey I went on. And accepting Christ in my life, it just set me free. It was as if he took me back. You see, in 1989, on the 8th of January, the rescue crews, the fire service, ambulance service, police and all that came together and got me and many other people out of that plane physically. But it was like that night in September in 2005 where Alfonso shared the gospel with me. It was as if God said, look, this is what I've done for you. And it was as if Christ had come into that plane and taken me out of there and set me free emotionally from the aftermath of everything that happened after my life, through choices I made. But he set me free, and my life hasn't been the same since. Nearly 9 years, and He just showed his love to me. He showed me what being a human being was really like, what he had planned for humanity to be like. Because I was representative of humanity in the sense of what the devil wants, and that is to kill, steal and destroy this race of beings that God created. He showed me a love for people that I'd never experienced before. He showed me the hurt, and he showed me the beautiful. I remember driving through Rhondda, going on a trip with the guys from church. It was quite a few months after I received Christ, and all of a sudden my eyes were open to the beauty of the world that God had created. Everything was so beautiful in colour, and its presence was just undeniable. Everything to me before was just grey and dismal. It was just, life just wasn't good. But meeting with Christ and setting me free, and I knew that I was able to give everything I had, the problems I had, the issues that I dealt with, the things I'd done wrong in my life. I could literally just give to him, and he would just wipe the slate clean for me. And that was like the most amazing thing for me ever.
So after that moment, drink, drugs, violence?
Clean. Within 3 weeks of receiving Christ, I was set free from drinking, drugs, doing the things that men do sometimes when they're troubled and they shouldn't be doing. 9 years now, nearly, I haven't had an alcoholic beer. I haven't touched a single beer. I drink non-alcoholic stuff. I'll have a glass of wine with my friends, my church family, my wife at home. Spirits, they're the worst. They did bring out the absolute worst in me. But I'm always constantly reminded, especially with that stuff, lead us not into temptation. So I don't allow myself to, and that's not to say that alcohol is bad for everybody, just those that can't deal with the consequences of drinking or taking drugs. I'll be completely frank, I used to love taking drugs, I used to love drinking. It doesn't make it good for me, it doesn't make it right either.
Nigel, there are going to be people listening to this that are going to be saying, I hear the story, I can hear about the changes, I can see that you've survived, you've overcome all this difficulty and tragedy in your life, but they'll be listening and saying, so what do they need to do? What difference will it make for their life, and what has Jesus done for them?
First and foremost, they need to realise, if you're listening to this recording, that you didn't decide to come into this world, God did. And he did that because he loves you, and he wants you to be part of his life, and he wants to be part of your life. He loves you more than you'll ever know. There's nothing you can do or say that will make him love you any more or any less. He wants to have a relationship with you. He sees the things you've done wrong in your life, even the things that you know that you think no one else knows about, he knows. The pains that you've gone through, seen and unseen, he knows about. All he wants you to do is, like any father, loving father, who sees a child do wrong in their life, is to turn around and say, I'm sorry, forgive me. Because God is a forgiving God, and his forgiveness is new every day, no matter what you do. He sent his son Jesus to die on the cross so that we can leave our pain and our sins, the wrong things that we do in our lives, at that foot of the cross, that we can be born again, as it says in the Bible. We can start afresh in this world that we live in, this fallen, broken world. He came into the world to cleanse a nation, a world of sinners. He came to set us free from eternity in hell. The Bible clearly says that Jesus is the way, the truth and the life. The only way, people are told so many different things, but the only way to heaven, the only way to spend eternity with God is through Jesus Christ, accepting him as your saviour, asking for forgiveness for the things you've done wrong, and taking him by the hand and accepting that you need to have him to lead you through the rest of this physical life you spend on earth before you go to your heavenly home to spend eternity with him. You need to make a decision today, because today is the day that you're hearing this, and you need to make a decision, because you will end up finding reasons not to do this, because we have so many selfish desires in life, and I'm speaking from experience. This is not condemnation on you. I believe I had many opportunities over the years to accept Christ as my saviour, and I suffered for it, not through his punishment, but because of the decisions I made. So I say to you now, if you're listening to this, you need to make a decision today, because that will determine your eternity, whether you go to hell or heaven. And I know where I want to be, and I know where I'm going. So I trust that you will make that right decision today.
Nigel, thanks for telling us your story. And we pray that God will bless you as you share your story all around the UK and even across the world.
Amen.
Skies lay low where you are. On the earth you rest your feet. Yet the hands that cradle the stars are the hands that bled for me. And in that moment of glorious surrender, you were broken. was lost, but to know you, to carry the cross, knowing I'm found in the light of the aftermath.